All right, so let's get ready to get going here. As I said, I'm Chris Hughes, Chief Security Advisor at Endor Labs. This is another session of LeanAppSec, and today we have a great talk for you focused on open source program offices. It's going to be coming from Russ Eling of OSS Consultants. So, Russ, if you want to give a little bit of background about yourself before we dive in.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Appreciate that. And thanks for having me. Let me just share my screen here. Looking all right? All right. Hi, everyone. So for those unfamiliar with me, I'm the founder of OSS Consultants. Before starting the company, I spent over 20 years in several engineering roles at General Motors. I had responsibility for designing and implementing a successful open source governance program at GM, which was among the first of its kind, at least at that scale, back in 2012. As the open source compliance officer, I built the OSPO that was responsible for reviewing software in every part used in every GM vehicle across the globe. And a quick word about OSS Consultants. So we're dedicated to helping organizations of all sizes design, implement, and manage some of the most efficient, comprehensive, and robust open source program offices. We're a full service consultancy, and we combine unique open source expertise, licensing, compliance, proficiency, and seamless collaboration to help you confidently manage all of your open source software while lowering security and legal risks. Our services range from conducting detailed scans and audits of your third-party and proprietary software to creating a full OSPO within your organization. So there are so many aspects to OSPO. So naturally, there are so many things to say about OSPOs. I was asked to put this session together as an OSPO 101. So I'll try to cover as much as possible, at least from an overview perspective. But given some of the feedback we've already received over the last week or two, I'm guessing we might need to have a follow-up session like an OSPO 201 or something like that. Um, so what is an OSPO? So there's many definitions of an OSPO depending on who you ask. At their core, OSPOs support and enable two primary functions, consumption of and contribution to open source. So given our limited time today and our audience will primarily be focusing on the consumption side. Um, so an OSPO serves as the center of expertise within your company, and it can be ideal if you need a scalable method to manage and track your company's use of open source. Typically, or usually, an OSPO is an organizational structure within the organization. So sometimes it's a formal organization, sometimes a little more informal. Many OSPOs start as a team of one and then grow from there. Sometimes we see an OSPO continue to operate as a team of one, but this usually comes down to need, like volume of software, budget, priorities, etc. Most often, the OSPO becomes a place where open source is understood and supported beyond just the technical construct from what might be viewed as a purely software development perspective. So this can include setting parameters for use, distribution of open source, auditing scans, setting up policies, training developers, ensuring license compliance, and sometimes promoting and building community engagement. So the office can also provide resources around advocacy, open source advocacy inside and outside of the company. And we'll get into some of these a little deeper shortly. So let's go down just one level in the spirit of OSPO 101, and we'll talk about what an OSPO does. So first off, establishes and maintains formal policies for your company's approach to open source. So this is often done in consultation with technical leadership as well as legal. Sets development guidelines around use of open source. So I find this part incredibly helpful. This doesn't need to be some complex document. This might simply be the takeaways that are most helpful to a developer. Perhaps the OSPO has an internal FAQ or wiki page on what the OSPO process might look like or who to contact with additional questions. License compliance. This may include running scans or reviewing scans. This should hopefully involve some kind of governance, especially when the reviews have produced results that might be inconsistent with company policies. Even more broadly than license compliance, the OSPO can often produce essential documentation such as notice reports, license notice reports, security reports, SBOMs, which helps identify and mitigate potential risks throughout the software development lifecycle. And if you're part of a supply chain, this can also include identifying any upstream security or licensing risks that might eventually make its way to you and your organization. If you're interested in learning more about the license side or the compliance side, we'll be doing a session right here with LeanAppSec in October. So this part might be underutilized, cultivating a company culture, but it's super important to cultivate that culture that's aware of why this is important. So when we're doing our training and education sessions for companies, I want developers to know that what they've chosen from what may be a purely technical perspective has other potential implications for things like intellectual property, permission for use, depending on the license, security, depending on the component and version. Educating on risks, this ties in a bit with my previous point. It's important for the OSPO to spread the message throughout the organization as to why managing open source is so important and what they can do to help. This can help guide and then reduce friction for stakeholders, which is important. So not just developers, but also legal, other leaders, procurement. And not the least important by far, but often one of the last considerations for organizations. Right or wrong, most organizations are concerned around the risk they incur from use and distribution of open source before they consider what to do about engaging externally, whether with a particular project they may significantly use or heavily depend on. So what are some of the elements that make up a proper OSPO? First off, I have to say there's no cookie cutter approach to this. There are several models from distributed to centralized and all combinations in between. We don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty details of each of these, but I'm happy to continue the conversation offline if you're interested in learning more. Again, let's start off high level here. So as I mentioned at the beginning, an OSPO often starts out as a single person who's tasked with trying to figure out how to manage the security or license compliance for open source used in projects and products. Once the usually very large scope of work is understood, the OSPO is then set up as a new unit or new organizational unit, new team that tends to grow enough to meet the demands of the company. This happens to be how I got started in my open source management journey more than 12 years ago at GM. Everyone's journey looks a little different, but I've heard from many people in the OSPO space that they've roughly followed a path not too unlike this. So let's get into some of the specifics here. So OSPOs are typically governed by policies, which then informs governance processes. The people in the OSPO then carry out the specific tasks defined in the processes and workflow. So let's pause here for a moment and briefly talk about these. So for policy, most organizations, if they have an open source policy, they've made them unique to their specific goals, beliefs, cultures, strategies. And as such, this should be the overarching guide for how the OSPO governs use of open source within an organization. The policy should be a statement of expectation regarding use of open source, and it should be communicated or at least available to most parts of the organization that are involved with software development. My preference is to have a minimalist policy. The ones we draft are typically a page and a half to 2 pages max. For the people in the OSPO, we have the leader, sometimes known as the program manager. Another title might be the open source compliance officer. This person usually has direct oversight, responsibility, and management of the open source activities in an organization. The leader might also have a hand in setting or maintaining and enforcing open source policies. Typically, this person has a previous experience with open source licensing and usually comes from a software development background. Working under the leader, we have analysts, sometimes called open source analysts or compliance analysts. Analysts are typically responsible for setting up or helping set up scans and then reviewing the results or outputs of those scans. Most often, this is for software that'll be shipped or distributed by a company. Once the reviews are done, this might also be the same group of people that generate your SBOMs and your license compliance material. If you happen to find yourself being the team of one, then you might need to perform all of these functions, but it might end up being on a reduced set of products since there just isn't enough time in a day for one person to do everything that an entire team is meant to do. So support for the OSPO often comes from others in the organization, such as an executive champion. So like most organizational efforts, an OSPO can benefit from the support of company leadership. That's why having an executive champion is so critical. Typically, we see this role being filled by an executive that has a technical background or technical role, such as engineering or security. And then for security, perhaps this is less support from security and more about collaboration with security. So there's a ton of benefit to sharing information both ways between the OSPO and security. I can recall many times finding out about the use of open source that I might not have otherwise known about if not for the information provided from the security group. But it also worked the other way where the OSPO would share information about open source usage that was discovered there. Legal, I guess the obvious support you might expect legal to provide for the OSPO is license compliance, which is true. But what about other information? What might someone in legal be interested in? How about intellectual property as it relates to licensing obligations that might require redistribution of source code? How about open source that might have potential export control concerns? So it's really important to have someone from legal that is supporting the OSPO. Procurement, I believe it's important for procurement to at least be aware of the existence of the OSPO. Even better or extra points if you could build in an OSPO review for any software you might be consuming for redistribution in one of your products or services. This at least makes the OSPO aware of potentially incoming software, and then they can decide from there if there's additional reviews that might need to take place. So for processes and workflows, it's important to empower your organization to balance the benefit, the business benefit, with the right amount of risk management. So without a good process for use of open source, you don't have any rules or control over what actually gets used. And then what to do when it doesn't align with your organization, whatever your organization might allow. You don't want your process to be overly burdensome. Less is more as long as it's efficient. Otherwise, it'll be really difficult to get people to follow it. And finally, tooling is most often required in order to understand your use of open source, and many of them can help automate the identification and tracking of open source components within your code bases. Software has grown too big to be effectively managed using any kind of manual processes. Tooling can often provide comprehensive visibility into the licenses, vulnerabilities, and usage of open source components, which has many benefits to the OSPOs, such as ensuring license compliance and managing security risks, among many other benefits like generating SBOMs. So let's look at what industry is saying about the growth in software and how this might have an impact on the increased awareness around OSPOs. So from the 2023 GitHub Octoverse stats, so this is for last year, there were 100 million developers using GitHub. So that was a 26% increase in all global developer accounts on GitHub. 98 million new projects were started on GitHub in 2023. Developers made 301 million contributions, total contributions to open source projects across GitHub. And finally, In this same GitHub survey, again from last year, it showed that over 30% of Fortune 100 companies have now implemented OSPOs to help structure organizational policies and procedures around open source. And GitHub, like us here, we expect this number to increase in 2024. So we have a growing number of companies that have been adopting OSPOs to be the center of competency for their organization's open source operations. If you compare that to even as recent as 2020 or 2021, we still had to explain to a lot of folks what an OSPO was. So we're seeing not just more awareness about OSPOs, but many new OSPOs coinciding with this growth in software. Beyond these data points from our own observations, we're seeing more understanding or better understanding of open source licensing in compliance staff, and we expect that this will continue to grow. C-suites across the globe seem more interested or involved in open source topics such as inner source or contributions to open source projects. So it's been a really interesting shift compared to years past. Additional perspectives coming to open source due to more users, so more awareness, which could be due to new regulations and availability of more resources, which we should get to here before we wrap up today. Here are a couple more quick data points on the increase in OSPOs and OSPO awareness. These are from a 2023 Linux Foundation report by the To-Do group on the state of OSPOs and the OSS initiatives. I'll talk a little bit more about the To-Do group later on. So 96% of organizations reported that their OSPOs have driven significant improvement in software development practices. So OSPOs are bringing more value than just license compliance. I suspect some of this improvement to be a result of reducing the burden on developers. And then the second data point, organizations with OSPOs are nearly always better positioned to leverage leading edge technologies. I suspect this is also due to easing some of the burden on developers, especially if the OSPO is able to make the onboarding or integration of new software technologies that much easier. Here are some of the more practical or direct benefits. So I touched on this on the last slide, but this is one of the biggest, if not the biggest for me. OSPOs reduce the burden on development teams. So a well-designed OSPO can take the heavy lifting off of a developer when it comes to managing license compliance and security. And so this really maximizes the value of the OSPO since it allows developers to spend more time doing what they're supposed to be doing, developing software. Crazy, I know. Identifying potential IP issues. This could be the result of an open source license that has IP implications, which could range from something that subjects your proprietary code to an open source license to patent grants in open source licenses. A different but related issue could be identifying a piece of software that might require a commercial license that a developer may have inadvertently used. The OSPO could facilitate a discussion to see if it's either worth replacing or procuring a commercial license to continue its use. Contributions to or management of SBOM requirements. So this most often comes down to inventory of software, which many OSPOs are doing a great job of managing. When you have an OSPO or similar governance structure, you get better understanding of use of open source within your company. You have better confidence in your open source posture, whether that's license compliance or security. Formal processes enable your developers to make informed decisions about the risks surrounding your use of software. And as a result, the company's exposure to open source risks, licenses, or security can be significantly reduced. In addition to all of these, implementing an open source governance program like an OSPO just directly helps you become a better software company. Beyond the value and benefits, here are some of the lessons I've personally learned about OSPOs over the years. So almost all companies that distribute or provide software need an OSPO, or at least someone to fill those functions. If you recall from earlier, this can absolutely be a team of one or a part-time person. I don't think I mentioned it earlier, but you can also outsource the function. So we offer a service to either become your OSPO or to provide temporary expertise to help get you started on your journey for those that are looking to accelerate that journey. With every release, someone is making decisions about the license compliance from your use of open source. You are either fully complying, partially complying, perhaps just at a top level, or not complying. So, from a risk perspective, it makes way more sense to know what you're shipping so that you're at least informed about the potential risks. Every organization has its constraints, whether that's people, funding, tooling, support, or whatever. It's really important to start somewhere. For strategy to be successful and efficient in starting or setting up your OSPO, you definitely need a strategy for execution and perhaps most importantly, someone to lead that effort. We spoke about policy earlier. So once your organization's committed to implementing an OSPO, you should start considering what the open source policy would look like or contain. Think about what elements are important to your organization, given not just the risks, but also your company's culture and strategy. As I said near the beginning, my preference is for a minimalist policy. That way, it increases likelihood that people are going to actually read it. Not many people are going to pour over and absorb a 10-page policy, except for maybe legal. For process, without a good process for use of open source, you don't have any rules or control over what actually gets used. And then what to do when it doesn't align with your organization, with what your organization allows. So it's really important to empower your organization to balance these benefits with the right amount of risk management. We didn't touch on developer training too much, but the focus here should be on efficiency and key developer takeaways. We can't, or at least shouldn't, expect to turn a developer into an open source license compliance expert. I really want developers to remember 3 or 4 things that I want them to do well when it comes to managing open source. And then creating an OSPO or other type of governance structure. I mean, this seems obvious given this presentation today, but it's important. So an OSPO doesn't need to be a massive investment from a resource perspective. As I mentioned earlier, you could certainly have an OSPO of 1 if that works for your organization. An OSPO of 1 might also just be a really good starting point. So OSPOs can be very effective, but sometimes challenging to get off the ground since much of what is required isn't really taught in academia. So you might be thinking, this is all great information, but what can I do at my organization to start an OSPO? As I said at the beginning, this isn't meant to be a step-by-step process. Every organization will be at different stages of maturity, have different environments, different strategies, different constraints. That said, these are some of the items that'll apply to most organizations and situations. None of this is really in any particular order as far as priorities, other than maybe the first one. Often the first step is to find or identify a leader of this movement. You're here. And so clearly you have an interest in OSPOs, so maybe it's you. Even if you become the leader of the movement, that doesn't necessarily mean you need to become the organizational leader of the OSPO. Think of this more as the catalyst for the OSPO. There might be some in here that might identify as both the catalyst and the organizational leader. If you're looking to lead the OSPO from an organizational perspective, you need to understand the company's business, plus have some business acumen in order to be able to navigate some of the non-technical aspects of starting up and running a new team, such as budgets, HR systems, company policies, company politics, just to name a few. So when you're going through this, it's important to understand that this comes down to an exercise in change management. So you better be good with managing change and with making it easy for people to deal with change. For identifying the benefits to the organization, we've already identified several benefits along with the value that an OSPO can provide. So those are important to communicate. Another approach or perspective to consider is what's in it for the organization? How will this benefit the organization? Will this improve security? ability to generate SBOMs, license compliance? The answer is most often yes. Um, for you define not just what the OSPO will do, but where and what parts of the organization it will apply to and which parts it will not. So, for example, an OSPO may start with a specific business unit and may only apply to that business unit for now. And then eventually the OSPO might apply to additional business units. Another way to do this is to have a single OSPO that starts with the responsibility for a single business unit or a single product that might have the most exposure from a risk perspective. Additionally, what will the OSPO be responsible for? Is it only license compliance? Is it generating SBOMs, overall risk reduction? Make sure you understand which of these are important to your organization and why they're important. Topic for another day, but I'm generally not a fan of organizations that have multiple OSPOs that all operate independently. Seek feedback and buy-in. So you want to start asking others in your organizations how their teams manage use of open source. It might be in a very informal manner, but they might be doing something. So they might already have something that you can leverage. And so this is a great opportunity to also solicit feedback on your new proposed process. I can remember way back shopping this idea around at GM and talking about the proposed process, collecting valuable feedback, because there was no way I could know each of those parts of the business well enough to be able to subject them to a bunch of new processes. But that was one of the ways I was able to understand some of the intricacies and uniqueness of different parts of the organization. So making sure that everyone from executives to the developers have a say in the creation of the OSPO or the process will help give the effort more broad-based support. I don't think it's possible to please everybody with the end result, and you likely won't, but you want to end up with something that accomplishes the goals and missions of the OSPO and one that works for the majority of users. You want an executive champion or an executive sponsor. So this can go a long way to making inroads across your organizations. Executives often have additional connections and influence that can help your cause, even if that just means making introductions on your behalf and conveying the importance of the OSPO during those introductions. You want to find a home for the OSPO. So you'll need to figure out, who does the OSPO report to? This will highly depend on your organizational structure. You may want to think about how this influences the focus of the OSPO. So being part of the CISO might mean that your OSPO has a focus on security issues and potentially less focus on license or compliance issues or intellectual property concerns, and perhaps less focus on contribution to open source projects. Engineering could be a good general home that cares about most of the functions of an OSPO. I guess the downside there, potentially, you could have budgets are sometimes more difficult to come by in engineering. Budgets is where the security org often has an advantage. For legal, we don't see this as often now, though in years past, it would not have been out of the ordinary to see the OSPO live within the legal department. So every organization has its constraints or challenges, whether that's people, funding, tooling, support, or whatever. But it's important to start somewhere. So how can I send you into this OSPO journey without letting you know some of the challenges that you might face? So budget is one of the biggest barriers and the one people bring up the most, but it doesn't have to be. So unfortunately, most times budget for starting an OSPO isn't really a top-down directive, though it does happen sometimes. So what does an OSPO need budget for? Most often it's for people, so OSPO headcount, tools for scanning. It could also be budget for travel to conferences, meetups, workshops. Other times, this might come down to business priorities. For most larger or legacy companies, it might be more difficult to be agile with this effort. In other words, despite your best presentations, the business may still push back on timing. For example, you might be allowed to get started with awareness and soliciting feedback, but you may not be able to hire anyone until the next fiscal year. And then tooling may be another fiscal year behind that. So, what can you do? You want to promote the benefits and value that an OSPO can bring. So, if that's not working, you might need to be a bit more creative with this, like creating a sense of urgency around the risks. I don't like to use the word fear because that word generates a whole bunch of negative associations. But what are some of the items to create this sense of urgency? So, license compliance lawsuits, there are plenty. New SBOM requirements from your customer if you're part of a software supply chain. Unknown use of vulnerable open source. Intellectual property concerns with some open source licenses. There's others, but I think you get the idea. So, who can you talk to in your organization? I'd recommend you speak to someone in legal. Sometimes they have access to different audiences and can make a different kind of argument for why this is important. Same with security. As we discussed earlier, there are risks associated with unmanaged open source that could cause some security professionals to stay up at night. Engineering might be interested in a new regulatory requirement from a customer regarding these SBOMs. But these are just some ideas just to get you started. Perhaps you've already started and you've been given the okay to start an OSPO, or you're still early in your OSPO journey. What other high-level steps can you take to formalize your OSPO and establish a solid foundation? So having a formal OSPO strategy policy process for your organization means better understanding and traction when it comes to managing your use of open source. So your inventory of your open source is critical because you need to understand what you're using and how you've complied. We only briefly touched on this earlier, but this can also help with assessing risk as well as helping to formulate longer-term strategies for risk mitigation. Discovering issues earlier in the development cycle means less impact on development times and teams, and to meet critical business deadlines like release dates. You can equate finding licensing issues or potentially security vulnerabilities to finding a bug in a software application. The earlier it's discovered, the less expensive and impactful it is to correct. You should require your third-party suppliers and OEMs to disclose their use of open source. You don't know your full risk until you know what you've used in your product. You also can't remediate or fix anything you don't know you have. And then the basics of open source compliance and management should be taught at all levels in the organization. So what have others done? If you're looking for even more information, there are a lot of resources for starting an OSPO. A quick search in your favorite browser will turn up lots of results. I haven't personally reviewed all of them, so it's difficult to comment on which ones are worth following. For a specific example, the To-Do group, which I mentioned earlier, is an open community of practitioners who aims to create and share knowledge, collaborate on practices, tools, and other ways to run successful and effective OSPOs. They have case studies, guides, and a very active community among many other resources. I would say they have more of a mix of both the consumption and contribution sides to open source. I've also noticed that several universities are now offering resources for OSPOs, perhaps just for their internal OSPOs. But there are some great resources. I haven't noticed any schools yet that are offering classes or other education for how to start an OSPO. We didn't get too much into OpenChain, but there are lots of great resources there as well. So OpenChain is also a project from the Linux Foundation. They maintain the ISO 5230 standard, which defines the key requirements of a quality open source license compliance program. For those that might be focused more on managing consumption of open source, by meeting ISO 5230 requirements, this often gets you most of the way to having a functioning OSPO. So the standard focuses more on what elements an OSPO or an open source program should contain and less on how. So how are the requirements, how they're implemented and met is up to each individual company, and certainly help is available if you need it. OSS Consultants is an official partner of OpenChain, and we've helped a number of companies with various stages of attaining conformance to ISO 5230, including BlackBerry, which was the first whole entity conformance and also the first whole entity conformance with an official open chain partner. Um, the, the Linux Foundation published a really nice, concise case study about how we helped BlackBerry attain conformance to ISO 5230. So we published a blog article on our site at the link below if you're interested, and we also have the link to download the PDF directly from our site. I guess while you're there checking out the case study, you can also have a look at some of the OSPO and other open source resources we provide as well. And I'll wrap up these slides here with a concluding thought. We've discussed at length about the need and importance of having an OSPO and an open source policy and following a process. But sometimes you really just need to start with the basics, which is a great place to start if you're not really doing anything today to manage your use of open source at your organization. As I said earlier, every organization has its constraints, whether that's people, funding, tooling, support. It's important to start somewhere. Aim for the lowest hanging fruit that you can reach. It's fine to start with an Excel list of the open source you know about until you can get support and budget for a scanning solution or a more formalized process like an OSPO. Do something. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. That's all I have for slides. I think we'll get to Q&A, but if you enjoyed this and you're looking for more sources of information about OSPOs or just open source in general, you can follow our company page on LinkedIn. We do weekly posts on OSPOs, best practices, trends, and other specific topics like SBOMs. As a reminder, also, we'll be having a licensing session right here in October and possibly a subsequent OSPO session. If you happen to follow us on LinkedIn, you should be notified of both. Just a quick thank you for hanging out with me and bearing with me through these slides. Feel free to reach out anytime if you have any questions. Myself or any of our team would be happy to help. Chris, over to you.
Yeah, it was
Do
an
you have any
amazing
questions?
conversation. Yeah, there's a few questions here that came in here. So one of them, you talked about, kind of the stakeholders, multi-discipline stakeholders who are involved. The question is a CISO or head of engineering better placed to build and manage an OSPO, or does it depend on the nature of the organization? Which is a good question. It could be manufacturing or it could be a software-oriented company. Curious your thoughts on that one.
It depends. How I put this politically correctly. It depends on where the money is. Where's the funding? Who's going to fund your effort? So for me at GM, we started in engineering, but then in order to grow, there was more budget happened to be available in security, and there were a lot of tie-ins, synergies, if you will, with security. So we became part of the security org, and then the team grew quite large, and we had that comprehensive support. Again, I think it's different at every organization. Budget may be the primary driver. If that's what's gonna get you off the ground, you can always move houses later.
So yeah, follow the money, folks. That's what you heard here first. So I was going to ask you. I actually had a question myself. Is you showed a slide
Sure.
there that I think it was about 30% of the Fortune 100 or 500 now have OSPOs. And I told you a little bit about this off air before we went live. But in the federal space, they just put out some guidance that in the next, I think it was in the 24 months, one of the budget priorities for the federal government is for agencies to start to establish, OSPO-like or entities within the agency, for example. I'm curious, knowing how pervasive software is, and your organization is a manufacturing company where you kind of got your start on OSPOs. Why is it taking us this long? Despite we know how widely used open source software is, it's in everything, it's everywhere. But only 30% of organizations in the Fortune 500 have an OSPO. The federal government's just now starting to look to stand one up in different agencies. Why are we just now getting here?
Yeah, I mean, so true. Yeah, that slide with the growth was pretty incredible. The numbers are staggering. My thought is that most of the focus has been on making software work or function and then securing that software broadly. So license compliance, which is often associated more closely with an OSPO, has traditionally had less of a focus, at least across the industry. I think we observed the change shortly after the US executive order on SBOMs came out. And more recently, we've got other global regulatory bodies, like there's the CRA in the EU, there's some regulations in Japan. These are requiring disclosure of open source as well, similar to SBOM requirements in the US. Um, I, I think a lot of this is just driving a lot of awareness. And for OSPOs, I mean, generating a comprehensive SBOMs it's difficult to do without a holistic process and without having a good inventory of what software you're using. But who already has this data? Mostly it's OSPOs. So they already have tools, processes, and everything in place to inventory what's being used. So their contribution to the SBOM effort, I think, has been pretty significant, even if only to supplement a separate organizational process for managing SBOMs. So I think as industries and companies are collaborating, there's just more awareness. People are talking more about OSPOs and the benefit they can provide. Again, I think it's more of the drivers seem to be around the time where we start to get the executive order come into place.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we're seeing, that broader awareness around software supply chains, the complexity, the potential risks, and that's driving, hey, maybe we need to have an entity to actually govern our use of these things. Another question came in here. It says, great session, Russ. Can you talk more about how you've handled pushback when starting an OSPO, how to overcome objections, organizational inertia, things like that?
Yeah. I think both when I was working within a large organization and then even now when we're helping other companies get this off the ground, getting that top-down support is super critical. If you can make everybody aware of the importance, the benefits, what happens if you don't do this? Like unmanaged risk is unmanaged risk, right? It's risky. And I think that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. You want to at least be informed about your risks, and this is one way to accomplish that. So, if you can make the right people aware, they can educate other parts of the business as well, and hopefully you get some traction.
Yeah, I agree. I think just showing what could go wrong and what has gone wrong in many cases, right? Already now
Yes.
we saw, and that was actually going to be another question I think that was out here was, do you think the rise of things like software supply chain attacks on open source, and this kind of goes to the cybersecurity executive order, where these are likely contributing to the need for awareness, the need for governance of open source, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, definitely contributing to the awareness. Again, I think this comes down to better management of open source and other software. You can't manage or secure the software you don't know about, so it often requires that you have an up-to-date, accurate inventory of software. Again, this is something that the OSPO is most often already equipped to deal with. So even with an OSPO, there can be an information sharing gap in some organizations. So it's important for the OSPO to collaborate with security and vice versa.
Yep. And then the other question is, you laid out some great resources, examples and frameworks and things like that. You laid out, the need for, multidisciplinary involvement from legal to compliance to engineering to development, cyber, et cetera. How do you go about getting all those entities to come to the table and be involved and be, invested in buying into this initiative?
Yeah. Previously, I guess in my former role, it was some of this was driven out of legal initially. So the conversation had already just organically taken place. We're talking 12 years ago. Things are a little bit different now. Now, when we're helping organizations today, it depends on who has brought me in or who's asked me to speak to a different person in the organization. And I mean, it ranges from sometimes it starts with a conversation with legal, sometimes it's a conversation with the CISO, sometimes it's a VP of engineering, product security. Yeah, it depends on who will listen, I think.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah. Who has the
Or who
interest?
initiates.
Yeah, who's going to be that, kind of that champion within the organization to push this effort forward is the way I would think about it.
Yeah.
So that actually was the last question we had. I wanted to, ask once more, like for folks that want to, learn more about you, the organization, OSPOs. Can you tell us once more where folks can find you, find information
Oh,
on your
thanks.
organization and so on?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Really appreciate that. So we have our LinkedIn page is pretty good. Lots of resources. So you can just search for OSS Consultants there. Our website, ossconsultants.com. We've got lots of resources there available for people. You can contact me through the website, through LinkedIn. Again, if you have any questions, absolutely happy to help, happy to schedule a conversation or informally by email, whatever you'd like. Happy to help wherever I can.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Russ, for joining us today and doing a deep dive on all things OSPO. For folks who tune in, thanks for joining us, and whoever catches the recording, a lot of great information here. That'll take us out for this session on LeanAppSec. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, everyone.